Hello everyone. Welcome to the first installment of my latest project, in which I hope to read through some of the fiction of J.R.R. Tolkien and provide some additional research, commentary, reflection, and general discussion as I go, chapter by chapter. The people have spoken, and due to popular demand, it appears that we will be starting with the Silmarillion, so thank you all for that. It's not, intimidating or daunting or anything. So I figured we'd better start at the beginning, not with Book 1 of the Quenta Silmarillion, not with the Valaquenta or the Ainulindale. No, we are starting with the preface to the second edition, which is an excerpt from Tolkien's 1951-ish letter to Milton Waldman, also known as the Waldman Letter or Letter 131 if you're referencing letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, part of this was published, as I said, as the preface to the second edition of the Silmarillion. A longer excerpt is published in Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, but apparently even that one is not complete. And there are some missing bits that were later finally dug up and included in Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull's Reader's Companion to The Lord of the Rings, which I don't have yet, inexplicably. So maybe note that one down on your next birthday or Christmas list, if, like me, you're really, really curious, what they would have cut out of that letter. It's not exactly a short one. It's over 10,000 words, Tolkien said, when he had finished writing it. So today I'm hoping to discuss the context of the letter, when it was written and why, some of the things that Tolkien touches on in it, what it contains, what we are to make of its contents in connection with Tolkien's other writings, both published and unpublished, and finally why it would be included as a preface to the Silmarillion, how it functions as a preface, what are the implications of that decision by the editors and the publishers. So I did some digging on this letter and the context of when it was written and for what purposes, and I think that's kind of the best place to start. So this letter was written probably sometime in 1951. We don't have the exact date, but sequentially we know it must have been around that time. It was written after Tolkien had completed writing The Lord of the Rings, and had also done some work cleaning up a somewhat presentable, mostly completed draft of what would at the time have been the Silmarillion. So The Lord of the Rings was written kind of at the prompting of the publishing house that had bought The Hobbit, which was Allen and Unwin. And at first, when they had contacted Tolkien looking into perhaps buying any sequel to The Hobbit, he had sent them in response a really messy fistful of different things he'd been working on in connection with the Silmarillion project. And they looked at it and said, but we asked for a sequel to The Hobbit, which, if you know, the Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings being so different in tone, imagine seeing the Silmarillion as a suggested companion or follow-up to The Hobbit without any intervening Lord of the Rings. And it's quite clear why they would have decided that, this is not exactly what we're looking for. They did recognize, the readers who reviewed it recognized that it was a significant achievement, but from a financial decision, obviously Allen and Unwin didn't want to publish the Silmarillion in this environment as a companion to The Hobbit. Understandably so. So Tolkien got started on the book that would become The Lord of the Rings, intending it first to be rather more lighthearted than it was and much shorter than it was, but it got tangled up in the Silmarillion and it kind of dragged it all along. Between that and his writer's block and his work responsibilities and the outbreak of World War II, it took him something like 10 years to get from, okay, I've started writing The Lord of the Rings to, okay, I've completed writing The Lord of the Rings, it's ready to submit to a publisher. But this whole time, he'd also been continuing to work on the Silmarillion, and in Tolkien's opinion, The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion were so enmeshed that it didn't make sense to publish them separately. Also, of course, he kind of sensed that he had Lord of the Rings, he knew that there was interest in Lord of the Rings, and it seems like he thought he could use this as some leverage to finally get the Silmarillion in print, which was sort of his goal, had been his goal for a long time. And there were letters exchanged. There was the problem of a paper shortage that was making publishing even Lord of the Rings, much less Lord of the Rings plus the Silmarillion, look like a horrifically expensive undertaking. Someone did the 1950s equivalent of hitting reply all, where they sent Tolkien a bundle of different correspondence that concerned him, including one where the suggestion was aired that perhaps they would accept The Lord of the Rings and publish that first, keep the Silmarillion sort of on probation, like, oh yeah, and then if it does well, then if it makes sense, we'll publish the Silmarillion too. Basically accept both books, but then hold off on publishing the Silmarillion, or else do it as a very sort of limited run. And like I said, Tolkien received this as part of correspondence going on between him and the publishing house and was a little irritated. It looked like they were going to pull a bait and switch on him. And at the same time, he's having these conversations with Milton Waldman, who held a sort of acquisitions agent type position at a different publishing house, Collins Publishing House, that really wanted to acquire the rights to The Hobbit, so they were trying to sort of court Tolkien and offer to publish his next books instead of Allen and Unwin, and then use that as their in to get The Hobbit rights, because The Hobbit, again, was really the moneymaker here. So Tolkien opens negotiations through Waldman with the Collins Publishing House, at the same time distancing himself, pulling back from Allen and Unwin, gives them an ultimatum, kind of double or nothing, take it or leave it, and they said, well, if you're going to be like that, then we'll have to leave it. Paper's really expensive, bro, and we just can't afford to commit to do, like, the whole thing. So Tolkien's basically trying to provoke a rejection from Allen and Unwin, so he has the liberty to shop the book to Collins. And eventually that deal fell through, and he kind of had to go back to Allen and Unwin with his hat in his hand and say, well, can you at least take Lord of the Rings, and maybe we can shoehorn some of the really important information from the Silmarillion into, like, the appendices or something. But at the time, Tolkien is planning on having Collins publish the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings together. And he's still finding himself apparently in the position to try and justify to the publishers why he thought it was so important that both books be accepted and produced together. And so in this milieu, Milton Waldman asks Tolkien to kind of explain it, summarize it, give an idea of what he's trying to go for here, and give an idea of what his goals are. This letter was sort of written as an artist's statement by Tolkien, a public, official statement of his books, his philosophy, his aesthetic goals, how he sees the plot going. He's addressing it to Waldman, but the intended audience is kind of the publishers themselves. And the reason this is important is because I saw a couple comments on Twitter and YouTube and questions not directed toward me, but just in my internet voyages, I've seen this question come up of people citing things found in letters to support or defend positions that they think Tolkien would have held, whether that be canonically, like what powers would the ring have had, or morally, like, well, he says in this letter that he thinks XYZ, so therefore that must have been what he thought on the matter. And there's problems with that, as you can probably imagine. A lot of these letters that we have are accessible through the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is a compilation. Most of the letters are edited. Most of them were intended to be private. There's contradictions within them, frequently within the same letter, but also between the letters themselves. And also we can see different views being held and facts being suggested depending on what time the letter was written. So, of course, that whole question of what is canon, and if Tolkien never intended for these to be published necessarily, then can we rely on the claims that he makes in them? And I think that in general, when Tolkien's responding to fans or critics or sincere inquirers, especially on matters of what date did this happen, or where would Numenor have been located, what was its climate like, the answers he's giving are going to try to be as canonical or sort of the final say as possible, because he really didn't like propagating contradictions. He wasn't the sort of person to, if someone wrote, can you explain this discrepancy between the runes on page 63 of book 1 and page 49 of book 3, Tolkien's response would not have been, it's a typo, bro, it's a publishing error, like, get over it. You're overthinking this. Tolkien would be the sort to be like, yes, well, you see, in the original manuscript, it would have been written like this, but due to the Sindarin cultural shifts during the late Second Age in this region, this manuscript would have held that. So I had to choose. But, he was very much invested in maintaining the sub-reality, as it were, of Middle-earth when he was dealing with readers on that level. So I think that, in general, letters are as reliable as any of Tolkien's other unpublished stuff, which is to say, your mileage may vary and context is crucial. But the Waldman letter, again, being an explicit statement of his intent and goals directed toward a publisher, I think has a little bit additional credence, because we know he's not just being perverse or capricious. He's trying to seriously and explicitly set himself this task. That being said, he also clearly has a position, an agenda, an argument. He's spinning a narrative that he thinks is going to appeal to the publishers and encourage them to do what he wants. That's not like to say that he's lying or being deceitful or misrepresenting anything. It's just that he is writing persuasively with a goal, and he's going to be emphasizing the evidence that supports his claims and encourages his audience to take the action he wants them to take, which, if you've ever had to sit through an English 101 class, that's not like being sneaky. That's just called being a writer, and a good writer who's writing with a purpose. So with all that being said, this letter is 10,000 words long, even though it was supposed to be a brief summary because Tolkien. And it ends with Tolkien saying, "I wonder if you will even read this." And Waldman does read it, and he finds it so interesting that he actually has it typed up for sort of preservation and ease of reading later, which is a big deal because, again, Tolkien, I think, references to, I wrote like a 40-page letter to Waldman last time I tried to summarize it briefly. And this letter does a few things. It explains Tolkien's creative process. It explains how and why he thinks the Silm is inextricably connected to The Lord of the Rings, which is kind of an interesting claim to make, looking at it in hindsight, because most people nowadays, of course, Lord of the Rings, very famous, widely read, widely known, even by people who haven't read it or, read it once and were like, eh. But even most people who have read and enjoyed Lord of the Rings are not immediately familiar with the Silmarillion. I think things have changed lately in the light of recent pop culture advancements, but when I was reading these books for the first time, most Tolkien fans didn't really know that the Silmarillion existed or what it was about. There, you might get a reference here or there on a really deep website, but certainly it wasn't something that the majority of Tolkien enthusiasts were conversant with, much less aware of, and it hasn't seemed to damage the Lord of the Rings' success. We find arguments even from Tolkien later on that he thinks not having the Silmarillion actually enhances the experience for some people because The Lord of the Rings is full of hints. Having those references without any clear explanation just increases, again, the sense of verisimilitude, the fact that this is some ancient record or account that we've received that is part of a world that we can only glimpse through Lord of the Rings, but it suggests a depth that goes back and back and back, whereas Tolkien says, well, if you know all the background behind it, it risks making it less mysterious, less appealing. So it's interesting to see Tolkien so adamant during this whole section of letters from around like letter 120 to letter like 135 or 36. He's including references to how inextricable he feels the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings are, to the point that it doesn't make sense to publish them alone. And then later on he would express kind of a different view, though he still very much wanted the Silmarillion to be published. So it explains that connection. Again, Tolkien's working an angle here. He has a goal that he's pursuing in emphasizing how important that connection is. And it's probably the best complete sort of summary of Middle-earth's history that we have that's in Tolkien's own words. Ergo, I will mention before anyone goes out and reads this or listens to the rest of this maybe, there will of course be spoilers in the Waldman letter because it is a summary of the events and the plot, more or less, of the First and Second Age. Nothing too specific, but something you want to keep in mind if preserving that suspense is important to you. Maybe hold off on reading this one. This letter also contains that infamous comment that Tolkien was trying to create a mythology for England. And it's unfortunately kind of become a polarized talking point where people have to take a position on it, and there's a canned little very tweetable paragraph or so summary of why your position on this claim is right or wrong or whatever, which I think is very unfortunate because it obscures any chance people have of exploring and coming to some kind of understanding of the very dense, complicated thing that Tolkien was trying to do, which I still don't understand. He fully never understood, I would argue. And you can't really just sum up what he's saying in the first pages of this letter in a 2 or 3 point summary that you then use to support your own claims, whatever they may be, about interpreting Tolkien. So I'm going to go ahead and read the whole paragraph from that essay that often gets cited in various ways and for various aims, just so we have the full text out there in the open. All right. Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land now long steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Of course, such an overweening purpose did not develop all at once. The mere stories were the thing. They arose in my mind as given things, and as they came separately, so too the links grew. Especially since, even apart from the necessities of life, the mind would wing to the other pole and spend itself on the linguistics. Yet always I had the sense of recording what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. He does call this ambition absurd and dismiss it as something that, he aspired to when he was younger, but now he's older and he knows better, but to me that comes across as very much sort of minimizing or acting dismissive towards something that he's actually very passionate about. This is a letter that presumably he gave some thought to. He's in control of the narrative here. If that's really something that he's rejecting and something that he actually truly considers absurd, then why would he describe it in such detail to these professional contacts of his? So to me, it's sort of the thing where you're revealing a little bit about yourself, but you're also not sure how you're going to be received, so you minimize it to kind of diffuse any potential awkwardness of like, oh, did I go too far kind of a thing. But again, that's just how I read that passage. That's interpretation. The other thing to notice is that this goal of his to create an overarching cycle of linked myths and legends and fairy stories, I think heroic fairy romances is what he calls them, only emerged after he had started to come up with the actual stories themselves. So this wasn't an ab initio goal for him. He wasn't like, I must create a mythology that is linked to the English language. Now how shall I go about doing that? No, he was writing the stories like The Fall of Gondolin and Baron and Luthien, and presumably the Feanorian drama kind of drew out of the necessities of some of those earliest legends. And as they became more linked to each other and developed their own sort of evolution and history and backstory and theology and everything, it was at that point that he realized, oh, I could make this into something. It could be a unified whole, not just a collection of stories. We also have to note that, again, in this context, he's proposing dedicating the work to England, to his country, which in the wake of World War II and all of the post-war paper shortages going on, that Tolkien was hoping to convince this publisher to sort of navigate for him, because they were paper producers as well as a book publishing company, so they had greater stores of paper. That's one reason why this project of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, published together as 2 volumes, was more feasible with this company than it had been with Allen and Unwin. If he can put a bit of a patriotic spin on that, I think maybe that might be an angle he's working or weaving in. Not to say that he didn't actually feel this way or that he's being totally disingenuous here, but again, he's trying to make a case for why they should do what he wants them to do. And if you've read some of Tolkien's letters and commentaries, you know that he tends to shy away from espousing what we would call jingoism or excessive patriotism, while at the same time obviously having a very deep love and affection for his country. And then we have to look at the fact that in the preceding pages, he's described how frustrated he was, not that there was no mythology or legendarium that existed that dealt with England, because of course there was. He mentions the Arthurian cycle, and he says that's great as far as it goes, but there are some problems with it, and one of the problems he points out is that it's about Britain as a nation, not about the English language. When I think about the languages that Arthurian stories are associated with, there's, and not far from an expert, but there's a lot of Latin names, a lot of Latinized names, which, maybe originally, again, Celtic, whatever that means, but got Romanized somehow. There's explicit links to, in some versions, to Aeneas, which is a Roman legend, the Aeneid, and a Roman folk hero, and descended from a Roman pantheon, in fact. And then there's a lot of, old French poems and lays and jests and things like that as well. But Tolkien is talking about how there's nothing that's really bound up with the English language, the same way that, for example, Norse myth and Norse language tends to go together, or the Mediterranean Greek and Roman. You can see the language influences the stories and vice versa. You get words and place names and names especially, we know how important nomenclature was to Tolkien, that have a link back to a story. And in Tolkien's opinion, the English language, as such, lacked that. You can see traces of it, and Tolkien, of course, being a linguist, a scholar of ancient, broken, lost tongues of mostly of Western and Northern Europe, a very highly respected commentator on Beowulf, and translator of some of the few fragments of Old English poetry that we have. He would have been very sensitive not only to just generally the relationship between a language and the stories told in that language, but also to the hints of what exactly an Anglo-Saxon, I guess, literary tradition, for lack of a better term, even though it probably would have been more oral than literary. He knew, as well as anyone did, what that might have looked like and what it might have felt like, which I think is more important and more what he's going for with the Silmarillion. He's trying to create something that would not recreate, but mirror the same sort of linguistic patterns and the same sort of, I guess, vibe or aesthetic of what he considers to be the ancient Anglo-Saxon or English literary tradition or myth cycle that he has glimpsed little bits and pieces of, but the majority of which has been lost. So really, in the context of this letter, coming as it does after a few pages about his language invention, his job as a linguist, his researches, his acute sensitivity to the matter of the fitness of a sound to the story that's behind it, which he calls a curse, to me it seems like it has a lot less to do with an English nation or culture or people, and a lot more to do with language. At least the way he's describing it in the context of this particular letter. One of his most commonly anthologized and cited essays outside of the realm of Middle-earth is The Monsters and the Critics, which is an examination of the poem Beowulf and a defense of it as a literary and artistic work worth researching on the basis of that, and less for what it can tell us about Anglo-Saxon, like, oh, we can hypothesize the declension of the rare Anglo-Saxon noun in the fourth degree. Like, I don't speak Anglo-Saxon, but that's the kind of thing that people used Beowulf for, and Tolkien comes in and argues we should also look at it as a story, and a story written by a fairly sophisticated author who is drawing upon a tradition that we have lost, so we don't get all the references, but he would have been, or seems to have been, and again, Tolkien's argument, he seems to have been very familiar with it, and he created something that even though we probably will never understand it, it's still worth inquiring into that aspect of things instead of just using it as raw material for reconstructing verbs. So even in his professional life, this was kind of the angle he was taking, and then in his aesthetic life, it kind of mirrors that. So again, I think it's something that doesn't really lend itself well to being summed up and turned into a talking point or a soundbite. I don't think we should dismiss this claim of Tolkien's. I think he meant something by it, and it was a sincerely made claim, but what exactly he meant by it, I think, again, has a lot more to do with his philosophy of linguistics, as it were, and a lot less to do with any sort of political, cultural, or even geographic concern that he may be supposed to have had based on people's sort of ideas in their heads of what Tolkien must have been like. So there's that relatively controversial little nugget dealt with. Other fun things to find in this letter that aren't spoilers include things like Tolkien summing up what he believes his main themes are, what he's trying to say with all this, and he kind of does scare quotes around that. It's like, oh yeah, every artist says, oh, this is what I mean by this. And we know in his letters he was very opposed to people trying to shoehorn his work into what he would consider too narrow an interpretation. We have an example of him saying that he dislikes allegory, a claim that he makes elsewhere, and something, again, that's been talked about a lot with regard to fantasy in general, how Tolkien dislikes allegory. Lewis tends to be a little bit more, I guess you could call it, allegorical, although even Narnia is not a pure allegory. There's no one-to-one correspondence, I don't think, between, for example, like Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the virtues of charity and prudence or something, which is what a real allegory would technically be. Narnia has characters. The characters have motivations and conflicts within them. They're not just personifications of abstract virtues and vices and qualities. And that right there was a tangent, first of many. Anyway, Tolkien says he dislikes allegory, but then in the same sentence goes on to say, but it's kind of unavoidable given that I'm trying to explain what I mean by all this. What's the moral? What's the theme? What's the message? And he pulls out fall, mortality, and the machine as what he considers to be his big themes. And of course, by machine, I've talked about this before, he has a very broad definition of basically anything that's subverting or dominating nature or the will of others to achieve a goal more efficiently. That's big for Tolkien, is domination. There's a few good notes on how Tolkien imagines or envisions the role of magic and the supernatural in this fantasy story that, as people have noted, does not actually have a ton of very flashy or well-developed magic in it. So if you're interested in how Tolkien thought about magic in his books and how he considered that others might think about it, this is one of the few sources where he sort of elaborates on it. He also describes a little bit of the distinctions and similarities and relationships between men and elves. He makes the note that this legend cycle is, in its origins, elvish rather than human, and so it kind of gives it an interesting flavor where, especially, again, talking about everything up to about midway through the Second Age, we as human readers are experiencing these histories through the eyes of a primarily elvish perspective, or at the very least a perspective of men that were heavily influenced by elves. So that's nifty. Having identified these themes, he also includes a footnote where he puts all of those under the umbrella of, it is, I suppose, fundamentally concerned with the problem of the relation of art and subcreation and primary reality. So under that umbrella of secondary and primary reality and their relationship, he places issues such as a fall or a loss of innocence or corruption, which we can see how typically the desire to subcreate is a very good avenue for creating corruption and evil. Mortality is a big one because the mortality of men is in Middle-earth linked to their ability to transcend fate, to leave the circles of Arda, and therefore to become a more potent subcreative force within the history of Arda, even though their time span is bound. And of course, the machine overlaps a good deal with magic and refers a lot to techniques that have efficiency as their motive, efficiency in bringing out perhaps a subcreative plan. And Tolkien's distinction that he makes elsewhere between magic or magia that is for the purposes of control or domination versus goetia or art, which could be the same techniques even, but just used for a totally different motive, and the magic of the enemy versus the magic of the elves. How the elves see that is very different because one is artistic in motivation and the other is oriented toward making your power felt in the world more efficiently. So that all does fit together very neatly under that umbrella, even though it may not seem so at first. He also talks about how he sees the aesthetic progressing through from the beginning of the Silmarillion, which starts with the Ainulindale, through the Silmarillion, which would be a grand sort of history into which he would set more fully developed versions of these heroic romances. So presumably he means something like Fall of Gondolin, Beren and Luthien, and the Children of Húrin, and he's planning on expanding those. And indeed, with Children of Húrin, of course, later he more or less succeeded with that one and took a good stab at Fall of Gondolin. And how that would progress down to an even narrower scope in Lord of the Rings, where it's very much like a novel. And ironically, for being a fantasy novel, it very much seems to be in the naturalistic tradition to me. We have very close narration centered on the perspectives of particular focal characters. The magic, like I've said, is not terribly flashy, and the way that it's described typically by characters such as Frodo or Sam, they'll be like, well, it seemed kind of like this was happening, but I don't know, it could have been my mind playing tricks on me. It's very much focused on their subjective experience and less on a narrator describing actually what's happening. And Tolkien is noted as having said that when he was writing The Lord of the Rings the first time through, before he went back to revise it more consciously, he was just focused on, okay, I've got this character, these are their strengths, these are their weaknesses, this is the situation they're in, what would a person like that be most likely to do? So very much a novel that's drawing on the techniques that makes it a very familiar read to someone who's grown up reading modern fiction. It really is a novel and not just a sort of long narrative. There's kind of a distinction there. And one that from this letter it seems that Tolkien was conscious of, where he talks about how he's writing in a mythic mode, then in a more legendary mode, and finally all the way down to the novel and the fairy story of The Hobbit and then Lord of the Rings. But it's not just an important letter, of course. This is our launch into the Silmarillion, And if you're reading the second edition or later, because I think my edition is later, but includes this letter as with a note saying this was the preface to the second edition. So one question I want to ask is, why include this letter as a preface to the Silmarillion? And how does it function as a preface? And when I first read the Silmarillion, I'm pretty sure I skimmed and then skipped over this preface. Kind of like the prologue to Lord of the Rings, where I, flipped through it enough and I was like, yeah, okay, he's talking about hobbits and dates this and dates that. I don't care. Show me the ring. Let's get going. And then later on, I went back and read it and I realized there's a lot of stuff in this prologue that you don't even get. Even if you read it really carefully, it just whooshes right over your head until you finish the whole book. There's references in the prologue to Faramir and to Merry's relationship with Rohan. And there's spoilers. For example, if you read the prologue, you know that Merry and Pippin are going to survive, which kind of takes a lot of the sting out of, for example, Return of the King, where Pippin and Merry both think they're going to die at several points, and it looks very likely. So there's that avenue. How much of this is priming us to go back later and be like, oh, I totally didn't even realize, and kind of a moment to reflect on, how far we've come. As I've mentioned a few times, it has some spoilers, but the edit that's in the Silmarillion doesn't really contain much that you couldn't have already figured out based on, for example, the Tale of Years, the appendices and all that, and then just pretty early on, all of the doomsaying. The Silmarillion is not really a book that relies on suspense. It's all going to end in doom, so it works all right, I think, from that perspective of teasing the plot without giving away some of the major twists and surprises. Tolkien wrote this as a letter that he probably didn't intend to be published to the general public in association with his fiction, but it was a professional statement of his intent that would have gone on the record, as it were. So I guess from an ethical perspective, that helps. This wasn't like some sort of intimate, private correspondence that he may have felt weird about having put on the volume called The Silmarillion that Christopher Tolkien had sort of shepherded into being after Tolkien's death from a lot of disparate sources. And like I said, it does a very good job of summarizing and explaining what the Silmarillion is all about in Tolkien's own words. It's one of the few and one of the most complete examples we have of that. One of the things that's interesting is that the version published in the preface cuts off after the Second Age. And in the more expanded version printed in the Collected Letters book, he goes on to describe the Third Age and how The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings would relate to the Silmarillion and why, at this time, he considers them interdependent. And that, I think, is a very interesting choice, considering that in the letter, Tolkien is writing under the belief that the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings may be published together, with the Silmarillion kind of coming first and then going on into the Lord of the Rings. And what actually happened is that The Lord of the Rings was published and widely read. Tolkien never lived to see the Silmarillion published, and those who read the Silmarillion are overwhelmingly people who have already read and enjoyed Lord of the Rings, although I will say exceptions do exist. I know a few people who read either the Silmarillion or Children of Húrin as their first exposure to Tolkien. Some of them have only read the Silmarillion, So it's nice for that very narrow subsection of the population that, you're not spoiled for Lord of the Rings when you read the Silmarillion. But for the rest of it, it's knowing how these pieces fit together would actually be very helpful. And given that it exists in the letter, Tolkien actually wrote this, which is not the case for a lot of questions people might have about Middle-earth generally, why not include that? That would seem to be the most important role that this preface could fill, is explaining to readers who are coming from The Lord of the Rings what to expect and what the relationship is here between The Lord of the Rings and this mythic sort of Middle-earth Bible book that they've heard about and they're finally starting to read, but people are like, it's so hard, it's so dry, you'll never get through it. And then you read it, and then Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age really is not the fullest account of how the history of the Third Age evolved from the events of the First and the Second. But the letter actually does a pretty good job of explaining it in the second half, which was not included. There's also the interesting choice of making this be the preface instead of including it in, for example, something that you would attach on to the end of a long story that gives additional background information. We could call it an appendix. And I think Tolkien may have been associated with a couple of appendices in his day. Just a hunch. The one thing I think it does do very well, though, as a preface. And I think the reason why it was probably included is that it does give people a context and a background for what Tolkien is trying to do here. And that's not always obvious, especially, again, if we're looking at the perspective of a young reader who's read Lord of the Rings and has loved it and feels like they want to progress on to the Silmarillion, and they're getting something very different, not only from Lord of the Rings, but maybe very different from anything they've experienced before. And if you have a little context for that up front, the idea that this is meant to be the mythic backdrop that Lord of the Rings draws its glory from. And if you're expecting a novel, you're going to object that this is not an engaging or successful novel. But if you understand that it's not meant to be a novel, that Tolkien has a lot of other projects that he's pursuing in this collection of writings, but novel is not one of them, then I think perhaps you're primed to accept it for what it is, and you won't be as frustrated or mystified or disappointed as you might otherwise be. So on that cheerful note, we will end our discussion of the Waldman letter and how it functions as a preface to the Silmarillion, and later we will launch into the Ainulindale, so I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on this and what questions and topics came up for you when you read the preface, if you read the preface, if you've read the fuller version in letters, or if you have access to that, how you think those two stack up and what the editorial decisions were and what motivated them, and also looking forward to the Ainulindale, which many of you have probably read. Some of you may be reading for the first time or revisiting after a very long break. Looking forward to seeing what people are expecting and what they're getting out of it. So thank you, everyone, for embarking on this journey with me, onward and downward.